Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Tolulokwe Babajide, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you today to the FSD Network Regional Plenary event in commemoration of the annual Financial Inclusion Week, which is being powered by the Center for Financial Inclusion. Today's event is titled Gender Financial Inclusion Policy in Africa, the Journey Ahead. And I have with me today brilliant and amazing panelists from across Africa who will be doing just to the topic. But before we go straight to the panel session, I will be setting some housekeeping rules just to ensure that everything runs smoothly. Everyone will be muted except for the panelist and the speaker and the moderator. We want to meet you. Please use the chat box to drop your name, your organization, and the country where you're joining from. And please use the chat box in case you have questions, and we'll get right to it during the Q&A. A bit about us. FSD Network is a family of financial sector deepening organizations, building diverse and inclusive financial systems across Africa that enhance the financial resilience and sustainable livelihoods for all and enable inclusive growth. To know more about FSD Network, kindly visit www.fsdnetwork.org. I will repeat it, www.fsdnetwork.org. Just before we go into the actual business for today, I want to ensure that we have people dropping their names, where their organizations and the country where they're joining us from, because we would like to meet with you, we would like to engage with you after today's event. In setting today's context, women's financial inclusion is a must if we must truly see sustainable economic growth in Africa. A persistent challenge to the achievement of improved women's financial inclusion in Africa is the significantly low capacity and commitment of the government regulators, financial service providers to mainstream gender into the regulation, policy, and financial services. In addressing these challenges, some African countries are beginning to stream gender into their national financial inclusion policies in order to ensure that FSPs are committed to inclusive data reporting. But still, we must all agree that we need to do more, and that is why we are here today. In addressing this session, we explore how FSDs supported or how they are supporting the integration of gender into the national financial inclusion strategies. What are the barriers? And how do we overcome these barriers? And what are the next steps to ensuring that FSPs are able to provide sex disaggregated data, which can be used to meaningfully improve product designs for women clients? Going straight into today's panel, I will be introducing our able, brilliant, and amazing panelists. And I will be starting with Esselina Macomb, CEO FSD Mozambique. Isaiah Owolabi, CEO EFINA Nigeria. Nikki Kettles, Executive Head of Programs, FIMAC Trust. Jackie Kitswell, Digital Economic Lead for FSD Uganda. Even seeing all the panelists, I know, and I'm very happy and I'm very excited that today is going to be a wonderful day. Going straight into the questions, I'm going to be directing the first question to Eselina. Hello, Eselina.
Hi, Dr. Good morning or good afternoon. It depends where all of us are staying at this moment. Thank you.
Sorry, Eselina?
I was saying good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us today. I'll go to the first question, and I have 3 minutes for each of for the first round of questions. 3 minutes per panelist.
Okay.
Citing Mozambique as an example, how has the regulatory guidelines or policies, how has it influenced FSPs to provide custom-fit services and products for women? And if possible, could you share with us how instrumental regulators' policies have led to a shift in the design of FSP products and services for women in Mozambique? I can take it again if you want.
It's fine. It's fine.
Okay, thank you.
I got the question. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be in this panel. And all of us were exciting this week as we are discussing different topics on financial inclusion. And today in this panel, it's around gender or around women. I want to answer your question not directly, because if you ask if there is a specific policy or a specific regulation in that regard, my answer will be no. But we are doing, in Mozambique, we are doing a preparation in order that one time we can have that policy really stated. So what are we seeing in this side? First is that there is a recognition that we do have a gender gap in terms of financial inclusion. There is also a recognition that we need to close that gap. And the question is regarding how are we closing? And in responding to that one, the first policy that is already in place or regulation is in place since this year is related to the segregation of data based on sex, not only by individual, but also for SMEs in terms of knowing, in terms of credit, in terms of deposit, all this aggregation of data. And I do believe that via this aggregation of data, via the result of that policy, we'll be able to address properly what type of service, what type of product can be designed in that direction. The other environmental instrument that is in place is that institutions like FSD Mozambique and others, and also from the regulator side, there have been a push in terms of human-centered design approach in pushing the institution to understand that it is time to design products that are oriented for specific needs for one segment. So in pushing in that one, I do believe that soon we'll have specific products that are oriented for different policy. There is also within the financial inclusion strategy, a specific working group on gender. That one, I do believe that in the discussion within that working group, financial service providers are now understanding that there is a need to design and to bring service and products that are more oriented to close that gap that I was mentioned. By the way, the gap in terms of access in Mozambique is at the moment at 5%, but in terms of usage, probably we might be having a bigger. So the fairness scope at one side has shown us that the decrease of financial exclusion was contributed by women in using mobile money, in using digital financial service. So the question here was what we can do in terms of regulation, what we can do in terms of design product that are helping financial service provider to address or to develop services that are oriented on DFS, on digital, but oriented to women. In responding to that question, FSD Mozambique is at the moment, together with its partners, developing what we call Agenda the Digital Financial Service Toolkit. And we believe that when we implement that toolkit, for sure, then a policy, a regulation can come in that direction of what can be done in order to design products that are digital, products that are oriented to women. So it is a process. So I was saying that if it is to respond shortly, the answer might be no, but those policies cannot come suddenly. It is a process that we have to see. So the other things that I think that we have to have in mind is that initiative that we are trying ourselves, what we call gender code, which we think that that gender code can also help the institution to understand the importance of gender in their institution, but also to their clients. So I will stop here, and then we can continue discussing in another way that topic. So summarize is that there is a policy in Mozambique regarding aggregation of data. We are going to continue working in that code of data disaggregation. We are developing the toolkit which will facilitate the development of policy, but there is also all these movements, and we do have within our financial inclusion strategy a specific working group discussing gender and financial inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esselina. And one thing that actually stood out for me is the lot of work that has been put in by the FSD in Mozambique, as well as the regulators and every other stakeholders in Mozambique. But it just also shows to us that this is a journey. It's not a destination. It's a lot of moving parts. We have to do this, we have to do that, just to ensure that everything comes together. And thank you very much for highlighting the work that FSD Mozambique has been doing and is still committed to doing. I'm still going to get back to you because I still have some questions for you. But now I will go straight to Nikki. Hello, Nikki. Are you ready for me?
I am, yes.
Okay. Nikki, FIMAC Trust covers the entire Southern Africa when it comes to programming, right? And that is a huge market. How have you worked with the governments of South Africa, Lesotho, Botswana, Eswatini in ensuring that there are regulatory guidelines or policies that influence FSPs to provide custom-fit services and products for women? And do you want to share with us particular success stories?
Perfect. Thank you very much. And good morning and good afternoon, depending on where everybody is. So just to take us back to a bit of history and where and why and how we try and understand gender. As Esselina mentioned, we have the FinScope surveys, and the FinScope and data is steeped in FinMark Trust's history. We're 20 years old this year, and we started life 20 years ago by implementing FinScopes. The evolution of FinScope over 20 years, however, has seen that we are now collecting gender disaggregated data in every single FinScope that we do in the region. And I think if we want to really start talking about how we're going to support and impact policies, we need to understand the nature of the problem. So already every single FinScope that is done in the region ensures that from a demand side, we understand the needs and what we talk about gender with a focus on women and what they require, what their challenges are. The one thing that we are pivoting a little bit on is that we need to be very careful about saying financial inclusion is about having access to a product or service. Because I think all of us as financial inclusion practitioners understand that it's not actually just about the product or service. It's about the implementation. You know, why is it not being used? We know from a gender perspective, there's social norms and cultural issues that often impact it. So we need to go deeper than that. We've done a lot of work with the regulators. We do a lot of work, for example, with the Committee of Central Bank Governors, on collecting supply side data also and moving them to ensure that they also collect gender disaggregated supply side data. So for example, from a cross-border remittances perspective, South Africa is the largest net sender on the continent, that data is now disaggregated, and we can see when it is a gentleman or a lady sending the data, because sending the remittance, because that helps us to also understand what is happening and what the differences are. From an MNE, we run the MNE for the Committee of Central Bank Governors to try and understand digitization in the region, and we are disaggregating, but it's a bit of a learning. Not all countries are collecting disaggregated data, so we work with them to say, but guys, we don't just want to know how many bank accounts. We want to know from a gender, from a youth. There's a whole lot of other information you need to support some of your policy initiatives and what needs to be done. I think the second thing that we all need to be very clear on from a gender perspective is that the disaggregated data is not where it starts and ends, because often you need to dig deeper, you need to do qual work, and you really need to understand what the challenges are because you want to implement. And we do a lot of work in that area. And I just wanted to explain something that happened last week, which for me was very encouraging. We run the SADC Financial Inclusion Forum once a year in the region. We bring all the ministers of finance representatives, as well as central bank governors representatives together that have an interest in financial inclusion and financial inclusivity. We've moved from talking about inclusion, and we're talking about economic inclusivity and uplifting people's lives. What was interesting, I'm sure a lot of you were on at that conference, gender was top and center. Every single regulator and every single central bank is wanting to ensure that gender is included in all of their policies. But something else that was very interesting, we had a commission on gender, and this just talks to us being very clear about when we say we have disaggregated data, what we're talking about. The lady from the central bank in Zimbabwe, and I'm sure she won't mind me mentioning this, said, no, 60% of all MSMEs in Zimbabwe are owned by women. And we all went, wow, that's absolutely wonderful, until we dug deeper. And in fact, it's 60% by number. But by value, it's much less because they are all MMSMEs. Now, if we only took the data that said 60% of SMMEs are owned by women and looked at policy, we would do very different things to when we go deeper in the data and actually realize they're actually MSMEs, and the type of policy interventions is different. So that is the approach and the sort of work that we try and do with all of the regulators and central banks to really get down to what the real issues are, not only looking at the top. I think a big thing is MSMEs. We know that women are generally micro, and a lot of work is needed there. And by value, the figure is much lower. I wanted to give you two success stories, which interestingly, well, they're not success stories, but by virtue of the numbers, something very interesting has happened. Cross-border remittances, the majority of receivers of cross-border remittances are women. And over the last 15 years, the price of the remittances, I'm talking about SA out, has dropped dramatically, and formality has increased dramatically. But it actually was, while it's mainly women, I don't think the policy specifically looked at how, what the challenges are to women receiving remittances. They looked at it overall, and we're already able to get such a great success rate. So imagine if we now start focusing on the women. So that's the first one. The other one is informal cross-border traders, where we are currently running a pilot, but 68% of all cross-border traders are women. But the policy is never about changing it to suit women. We're still looking at the normal rails and increasing. So imagine if we specifically looked at women. So those are sort of the two areas, and the thought process around the data and the evidence, and really getting into the nub of what the problem is, and that implementation bottom up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nikki. I had a good time listening to you talking about the work that you've been doing for the past 20 years. And congratulations to FIMAC Trust on your anniversary. And also, one thing that stood out for me is that financial inclusion goes beyond access. It goes beyond just counting the numbers of accounts, numbers of women that have savings accounts or have current accounts. It's about looking in-depthly into the demand and the supply side, looking at the various sectors and seeing how everything can be integrated, how we can look at every line and mainstream gender. Thank you. I'm still coming back to you. But right now, I'll go to the holy man in this room, Isaiah. Hello, Isaiah.
Hello, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you too?
Very good today.
So I'm going to go to your question, and I'm very particular about your question. Nigeria is a home to over 200 million people. In fact, Nigeria is the most populous country in the continent, with lots of different ethnics. I want to know how EFINA is working with the Central Bank of Nigeria in actualizing the current gender financial inclusion policy, and has there been any shift in the number of women, when it comes to transitioning from the exclusion part to being included now, and not necessarily looking at access, looking at usage now? Over to you, Isaiah.
Thank you very much for your question. And I think it's very important that this panel is coming up, especially when the reality is that investing in gender financial inclusion or financial inclusion from a gender perspective is not just about women, it's about economic development as a whole, it's about systemic development. That's what it is. And most importantly, when you think about how we're working with CBN, especially, or how our work with CBN and what that has informed in the form of access to financial services for women. First, our work with the CBN involves championing evidence-based advocacy for all, especially innovative women inclusion interventions, and providing technical support to all stakeholders involved in policy development. We like to refer to ourselves as the honest brokers. What that means is we play a good role between making sure that regulators and operators have conducive platforms to accelerate the impact of financial inclusion intervention, especially for those who need it most. We know that those who feel the impact of exclusion, mostly women and girls. And we have definitely seen that exclusion rate have reduced. If you look at access to financial services survey in 2018 compared to 2020, we saw that the number of women who had access to bank accounts increased during this period from specifically 33% to 39%. So that's definitely some progress. But there were also other indicators or other ways that we're working with the Central Bank of Nigeria, who is also at the forefront of driving financial inclusion for women. Because, like I said earlier, it's not just about making sure that women have access to financial services. It's because of the economic promise that this holds for the country as a whole. When we invest in the financial inclusion of women, there's a lot of promise. And also the data that we use to support the sector, including regulators. And we also know that when we talk about financial inclusion, as a regulator, CBN is not the only regulator that we support with our data. The pension commission, the insurance commission, because all of these elements are very much important into ensuring that women have access to quality financial services. So we also carried out surveys and data to benchmark what the state of women economic empowerment is in Nigeria. And we use this data to support different sector and regulators across board, including the CBN, and also supporting the financial inclusion delivery unit to make sure that the intervention from this unit is gender friendly and from a gender perspective. So this are some of the ways that we have been supporting regulators and also key operators across different sectors. I will leave it at this point and let the conversation continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Isaiah. And it's so interesting to hear about the work that you're doing with not just Central Bank of Nigeria, but to PENCOM, who is the regulator for pension, also NICOM, the regulator for insurance, and also maybe SEC. It's good. I'm going to come back. I have a particular question for you, but before we go to the next round of questions, I will go straight to Jackie. Hello, Jackie.
Hi. Hi, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you too?
Very well.
FSD Uganda has been very active in designing specific gender inclusive programming, right? And what I want to know is how you have worked specifically with different regulatory bodies to formulate and to implement policies, which have in turn influenced FSPs. And I want you to cite examples that have now, led to the design of custom fit services and products for women in Uganda. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. We have seen a lot of reforms taking place in Uganda in the past few years. And one of the leading reforms in this area has been the enactment of the NPS Act, which has allowed or has brought in very many innovators that were outside the regulatory space. And this act came with accompanying regulations that have allowed the central bank to put in place a sandbox framework that continues to bring in innovators that are coming up with sustainable business models to serve women and other excluded segments of the population. We've also seen a lot of effort around consumer protection. We are all aware that women are also very disadvantaged. FSDU carried out a study and actually found out that the way FSPs treat women when they access financial services is not the way they treat men, mostly because of economic and social norms around that. So we've seen more regulators working very hard to put in place, to strengthen the consumer protection frameworks that are in place, and we have been supporting such work. Also very important is that we know that most women and most women-led businesses struggle to access finance, mainly because they don't have access to hard collateral, which is the primary source of securing loans or credit, at least within the Ugandan context. So we have worked with the Registration Service Bureau to put in place we supported the putting in place of the Security Interest in Movable Collateral Act, which we believe is supposed to help the FSPs be able to register collateral in a movable collateral registry. We know that most of the women, as someone has mentioned already, most of the women their businesses are very micro and small, and most of them don't have assets to put up as collateral. But by putting in place this sort of framework, we believe that FSPs are able to lend against collateral that the ladies have, be it a small sewing machine or a motorcycle. We are still seeing a lot of challenges in uptake of this particular infrastructure, especially around FSPs not being able to ably capture risk around movable collateral. We also see policy impediments around this. For example, right now, credit insurance providers as a discount movable collateral at a very, very, very high cost to the FSP and to the customer that is borrowing. So as much as there's been a lot of work done in terms of trying to put in place policies that support women access to finance, we still see that a lot still needs to be done to support the different implementing institutions to bring around policies then that make usage and acceptance of these policies in place. We've also done a lot of work around infrastructure. Right now, we have been supporting the National ID and Registration Authority to enable eKYC for all financial service providers. At least the regulated tier 1 institutions can now verify and authenticate customer details in real time. So all banks are connected to the national ID database, providing for simplicity in eKYC. We want to see as FSD Uganda how we can roll this out to the lower tier institutions, because we know that most of the women actually access their financial services from lower tier institutions and not banks. So once this is in place, obviously we know that low tier institutions have less sophisticated systems, infrastructure, skills, and we know that there's going to be a little bit more work to do than we did with the banks. But we know that once this is in place, then we will see easier onboarding of female clients, especially those that are in rural areas. I would say the last is around credit information sharing. Again, we know that most of our women are borrowing or accessing financial services from low tier institutions, and no one is collecting data from them, even though they are good borrowers, but we don't have an integrated database of the credit information around that. So they are still borrowing very expensively. Some of them are unable to access financial services because we have very poor, very fragmented credit information sharing. So the Bank of Uganda is in process of establishing, reforming its credit bureau regulations to allow these smaller institutions, the tier 4 institutions, to actually report to the credit reference bureau so that we can remove that data information vacuum that we are currently facing. And we, as FSDU, are actually working with one of the credit reference bureaus that are piloting how they can bring these smaller VSLAs, SACCOs into the credit information sharing environment. I think for now, I'll stop at that. There is still a lot more that we are doing, but I think I'll just share that at this time.
Thank you very much, Jackie. And the beauty of everything that you said today is that when it comes to financial inclusion and when we talk about policy, we should be very intentional in looking at the different sectors, different moving parts, and not just focus on one part. I love the part where you mentioned, what you're doing around KYC, what you're doing around insurance, what you're doing around the credit worthiness. That is so amazing. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. And probably in the next round of questions, we'll get more from you. And as we move on quickly to the next round of questions, I want to inform the audience that you can please use the chat box, drop your questions, and our team we are going to get right to the question and answer section. I'm going to go back to Esselina. Hello, Esselina.
Hi, Tony.
I know in the audience we have regulators who are in the process of drafting a women's gender financial inclusion policy. What do you think must be the key pillars and recommendations in such policies? What should be included? What would you like to see? What should not be included? Can I go over the question?
Thanks. I'm laughing because what should not be included maybe might be something. But the way that I think first is that it's important that we know what really we want to do with that policy. And as Nick was saying, the most important is to know the cause of that CAB, so that when we do a policy, that policy can help us to remove the cause. Because otherwise, if we do not understand, then we end up in doing a policy that we implement, but the gap might be still there. So going direct to your question, I think that the gender policy for financial inclusion has to have two vision, if I can say, or two ways. One is first that if you want financial service providers to design product data oriented, to be more gender sensitive, the first question, which is in my first vertent, is that those financial service providers, they have themselves to be gender-based institutions. In saying that, for me, is that there is a need to have that institution before go to their customer to see how is gender sensitive, how is their gender audit, how this institution is gender-based, because then it will be easy to implement a solution which are based on gender. So there is that one that I'm calling more on institutional side. We needed to have some policy on institutional side related to gender. And that one is not, for me, not only valid to the financial service provider itself, but also for the regulator. They have to give an example. They cannot say we are moving to a gender, whereas the gender is not embedded within the institution itself. That one is, for me, one way of seeing the things, and maybe it's the initial. We need to have those gender auditing. How are our institution? Do we have a salary discrepancy within our institution? How will we deal with this gender in our institution? Going to the second part, which is in somehow related to direct to our question, I'm trying to bring some pillars that I think that needed to be within that policy. For me, there is a pillar that should be related to the creation of enabling environment that really push us to that gender way of designing product in terms of access, but mostly in terms of usage. And how are we designing product that really they are using and improving the quality of life? That one is in somehow relating to instruments, related to policy, related to facilities, to the framework that we can bring in order to enable that environment. The second one is related with a topic that we have been already discussing in terms of data disaggregation. What are we saying in terms of data disaggregation? How those data are disaggregate? And what really are we saying to the institution? Because it's not just to disaggregate data and you do it. It is important that you analyze how are we interpreting and how are we understanding those data that we're having for demand side, but also that we're having in the side of the supply side in order to help us to move on in terms of gender. The third one is pillars that I'm suggesting is that in our policy, we will not ignore that we're in the digital era. We need to bring innovation here, and also how innovation can help us. So should be some things that we're saying in relation to innovation. And the next one is related to capacity building. What type of skills do we need in order to move on in that journey of gender equality and the gender oriented to gender-based society in terms of financial inclusion? Are those type of things that I think the policy will have to say some things regarding those topics that I have put in as pillars, coming for what should not be included. That one I think is a little bit tricky at this time. But for me, we have to put policy that are not increasing the gap, they are not making the gap even deeper. We need to bring policies that are leveraging and moving us to that gender. So I think the policy should be more oriented in that way and not bringing more discrimination and more things of that in that direction. This is what I can say. I don't have something concrete what should not be. I think the policy should not deepen the gap. and the discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Estelina. That is really deep. And it also just points to the fact that we have a lot of work to do in Africa, particularly FSDs, financial sector deepening organizations, to ensure that we are really working closely with the regulators, not just the central bank, but all the regulators that are directly involved in formulating policies that will, push forward women's financial inclusion. I'm going to go straight to Nikki because we have some questions and we don't want to run. So for each of our panelists, you have 2 minutes to respond to the question. So I'm coming straight to you, Nikki.
Perfect. Okay, so
I'm not asking, I'm going to, yes, it's still the same questions. So, but I just wanted to add the context of the Southern Africa, but please go ahead. I'm sure that you get that. Please go ahead.
Very much, and I'll quickly go through it in 2 minutes. So the first thing, which was debated at length last week, was, do you have a financial inclusion policy and gender as a subset, or are they separate? And what was very interesting was, from a policy and regulatory perspective, it was felt you have a financial inclusion policy with gender as a subset with its own policy that feeds into it, to make sure that you can align the countries and that you're pressing, the same button what is done. So, and it was an interesting debate. It was unanimous to have the financial inclusion policy with the gender policy as a subset. Then in terms of the pillars, I'm going to be a typical engineer and just give you the 5 that I always think about. I think about information, which is the data, scratching the surface, getting in deep, understanding norms and cultural issues, and really, like my SMME example that I spoke about earlier, number 1. Number 2, the full value chain to supporting livelihood. And I'll give you an example. We did some work recently with our SASA grant recipients to understand the digitization of social grants. You cannot only look at that end piece around the digitization of social grants. You need to look at the full value chain, which talks about awareness and financial literacy, onboarding, usage, access, the whole value chain of how you get someone to appropriately use a digital financial service. And for gender, we did, because you may find, for example, that it's easy to get a bank account, but it's very hard for a woman to find an access point because they're gender insensitive. And you need to understand that full value chain to support it. So that's number 2. The third one was a regulatory and policy environment that is flexible and accommodating and allows that teach and learn. So the innovation, the allowing sandboxes, because we often don't know what we don't know. We make assumptions, but we don't know what we don't know. So not only must the policy be flexible to be able to absorb some of the changes coming through from the analysis, but also to be able to test and see until you get where, to where it needs to be, because it isn't an exact science. The fourth one, and I feel very strongly about this one, is the evaluation. That constantly having your baseline, where do you want to go? Tracking, are you reaching your baseline? Why are you not reaching your baseline? Do you need to change? Because often we change the policy, or we change the way we do things, or we change the product, and then we all sit back for 5 years and go, oh dear, it didn't work. It's got to be more consistent than that, and you've got to really understand it as you go through the process. So really, for me, that's the 4. And then the 5th one, what do you exclude? And for me, it's about those unintended consequences that we need to be quite clear about, because sometimes we do things. I know in Malawi, I think it was Malawi, they've got the VSLAs, which are informal more, that they're thinking of regulating under the banking environment because it'll be regulated. What are the unintentional consequences? And those are the things that we need to be very careful of. Not saying it's a bad thing, but we need to remember that it's not always a straight line. We need to understand the value chain. That's me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nikki, and that was really spot on. I would have loved to dwell more on what to pick out some point, but because of the time, I'm going to quickly move to Isaiah. Isaiah, I need you to answer this question in the next 2 minutes because of our time, and we still have some questions in the chat box that we would need the panelists to answer. Knowing how proactive CBN has been on implementing the gender financial inclusion policy, CBN, for the sake of the audience, is the Central Bank of Nigeria. Knowing how proactive they have been in implementing the gender financial inclusion policy in Nigeria and the role that FINA have played, what would you say are your roles in pushing for the emergence and implementation of women's financial inclusion policy across the continent? And Nigeria have done beautifully well when it comes to the regulator taking charge when it comes to women's financial inclusion. So how are you going to ensure that there is lessons that are shared across the continent so that it's not just Nigeria that is benefiting from this, from this beautiful success story? Over to you, please, 2 minutes. And once it's 2 minutes, I'm going to cut you off.
Thank you very much. They always say, collaboration is the new competition, and that's one of the biggest things that we always encourage across the sector. For whatever type of research that we have conducted, we try to collaborate with people across key sectors, including the Central Bank of Nigeria and other development actors across the continent to make sure that it is disseminated appropriately, and also people are able to understand it in the way that they can use it, because it's very important. It's not only important for us to churn out some of this research, but we should be able to ensure that people are able to communicate it in a way that people are able to use it. So we've been conducting research that promote the value proposition of women's financial inclusion, improve the value of financial data disaggregation, and ensuring they can lead to transparent and inclusive policies for women. We've also advocated for gender disaggregated data, building stakeholder capacity to collect, analyze, and make an informed decision using the collected data. We've also supported and championed innovations that support greater financial inclusion for women. A typical example is our recently concluded MSME Finance Hackathon, where we focus specifically on accelerating the impact of financial access for women-led and women-owned MSMEs, because it's also key for us to make sure that when women have access to finance, they are able to translate this to real sector opportunities in the form of transforming their lives, helping them to have access to healthcare, education, and other forms of intrinsic and extrinsic value that is important to them. I'll leave it at this point, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Isaiah. And there's a question for Nikki, and there's a question for Estelina, but I will quickly go to Jackie for the last question. Jackie, please, 1.5 minutes, please, because of the time. We are really, really stretched for time. I want to ask, what are the roadblocks? What roadblocks did you face in developing and implementing programs for women's financial inclusion that can only be resolved by policy intervention? I haven't done everything, designing appropriate interventions, but there were still barriers, and we know that these barriers can only be solved by a policy intervention. Have you experienced that in FSD Uganda or Uganda as a whole? 1.5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. I think there is a study that has been done that we have been part of, and it talks about funding for women financial inclusion and women economic empowerment. And one of the key things that is coming out that we see is that women financial inclusion programs or women economic empowerment programs are often embedded within bigger programs, and there's rarely specific attention that is given to it. So one, we found that sometimes these programs are underfunded. So because they haven't been given any specific attention, there isn't enough funds that are put aside for it. But also, and what we think is more important right now is that even when they put funding for such programs, when it comes to implementation, so even though funds have been earmarked for a specific intervention, when it comes to implementation, there are no implementation structures to actually go along with the programs. So by the end of the budget year, these funds have not been absorbed and hence then been reallocated to other more needing sectors within the economy. So as we come up with policies for women economic empowerment, and as we come up with policies for women financial inclusion, we also need to know that we need to strengthen the capacity of the implementation bodies or institutions or structures to actually be able to implement these programs. One more.
I will stop.
Okay,
We are really
that's fine. Yeah.
I'm so sorry. But if you still have like 1 minute or thereabout, I'll come back to you. But I will go straight to Nikki. There's a question by Bevan Manabo. Thank you for your question. Bevan is asking about cross-border
trade.
I'm trying to pull out the question.
It's cross-border trade, eh?
Cross-border trade. If you can see the question, please go ahead and answer it.
Okay, so I'll tell you the work and how it evolved and what we are doing. We did some scoping on informal cross-border traders between South Africa, Lesotho, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique. And we found that due to the informality, most of their business was carried out in cash. We've done a lot of work historically in Finmark on cross-border remittances. And what we did was we spoke to the regulators, both in South Africa and in Lesotho. Our pilot is running between South Africa and Lesotho, to say to them, the same way that we formalized cross-border remittances and got people to start using the digital channels, can we please test and see if we can formalize the payment, the access to finance side of informal cross-border trader payments. And we've received permission on both sides from both central banks to we've got special codes in a sandbox. We are testing using remittance channels. So it's that payment channel, which I know is P2P, but it's in a ring-fenced environment, to see if we can digitize initially just that payment aspect of it. So here we have the policymakers, the regulators, the two central banks getting together. What is interesting is 68% of all of the informal cross-border traders are women. So now we need to overlay to make sure that that product that we are testing is also gender friendly and they can use it. So that is the approach, and that is the bottom-up way that we will then work, and we'll work with the regulators, because from a regulatory perspective, we all need to always remember that you rather want people in the system than out of the system. From financial integrity, from all of those good things, you want money to flow in the system. When it's flowing in cash, you can't manage it and you don't know what you don't know. And I think that's where our regulators are amazing. You know, they came together. This is a very unusual request, and they are allowing us to use remittance rails to test payments for trade, which will then support what they need to do from a policy perspective. So I'm hoping that that explains the way that we've done it, because that's how you have evidence-based policy changes also, because it sounds risky initially, but once you've tested it, you'll prove where it is and isn't. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much, Nikki. And we have a question from Jasmine. Are we putting and this question is going to Esselina. Are we putting too much pressure on providers? Do government also have an obligation to build out physical infrastructures where women are, developing financial literacy curriculum, making public information campaigns to counter harmful norms? Are we putting too much pressure on the financial service provider? Over to you, Esselina. 1 minute or 1.5 minutes. Yeah, right.
Thank you. My response is that debate around the gender financial inclusion and also financial inclusion in general is not for just one group. one segment. Either financial service provider, regulator, civil society, we need to work together. Really, I fully agree. The governments, the regulator, they have a role to play here, but also the financial service provider. Maybe the discussion that we had here was more oriented to the side of the implementers, but there is also a role of what infrastructure that we have. If we want to, for instance, use digital, is the infrastructure to use digital. If you want to have ID, is the ID already with the citizen? So all of us, we have a role to play in financial inclusion. And the important is that we know what we need to do and where we want to go and go together. So partnership is, for me, collaboration is the key words here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Estelina, for that quick answer. We have a question, we have a comment from Nan, but now we have 5 minutes, so I'm going to quickly rush over Nan's comment. But I will firstly go, we have a question from Sophie. FSDs are interested in financial services as a mechanism for economic growth and improved livelihoods. Is it difficult to work with regulators on gender and move the conversation away from the access to finance, which is measured by accounts, for example, to women's economic empowerment and the greater complexity of that concept? I know, this question is going to take us a lot, and I'm going to quickly give Isaiah, I'm going to quickly give you 30 seconds to answer this question.
Well, I would say that using the word difficult is a long one, but I would say challenging might be a good one because, like we said, it's a journey, it's not a destination. And the process to working with the regulator to make sure that we are having conversations around the fact that people open bank account does not mean that they are living good life. It's potentially an opportunity. For example, Nigeria started talking about the potential for a women economic empowerment policy, and also aligning that to our national financial inclusion strategy. So that's a starting point. We all know that the implementation or rollout of a policy is just the beginning. Implementation of it is then the big challenge. But I think that it presents a big opportunity to start having that conversation. But the starting point for us also to convince this regulator is to use data and what's possible to actually support them in changing the game. And we also know that regulators need a lot of capacity in terms of supporting them to achieve some of these things that we see will create huge opportunities for women across board.
Thank you very much, Isaiah. We have, it's not a question, it's just a comment. Many thanks to the esteemed panelists and attendees. Statistics generally show that policies and initiatives that benefit women have the impact of building up local communities and the wider economy. Therefore, suggesting this sets the narrative. Just a thought. Thank you, Leanne, for dropping that. And I just really want to appreciate everyone. We have 2 minutes, and I just want each of our panelists to drop one last word, just a word as we round up. Thank you very much. Over to you, Estelina, just a word.
Yeah, the one gender, I think gender is very important as the majority of our population are women. We cannot ignore that segment.
Thank you, Estelina. Over to you, Nikki. Just one word.
It's implementation, gender implementation. Let's not only talk policy. Let's see it happening.
Thank you. Over to you, Jackie.
Digital literacy and numeracy.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Isaiah.
Investment in women's financial inclusion pays everyone.
I love that. Thank you so much. I want to especially appreciate all our attendees. Thank you for sitting with us for the past 1 hour. Thank you to Center for Financial Inclusion. Thank you to our panelists who have done great justice to the topic today. Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Estelina. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Isaiah. And thank you. And in case you want to know more about FSD Network, just as I earlier mentioned, kindly visit www.fsdnetwork.org. Thank you very much and have a wonderful time. Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much, and bye-bye. Yeah,
Bye.
let's see them.
Bye.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.